before she died, Rocky Dennis's mom finally broke silence about Rocky Dennis, and it's bad. You think you know this story. A boy with a face that stopped strangers cold, a mother who refused a break, a movie that made an entire generation cry into their popcorn, Cher in a leather jacket, Sam Elliott brooding in the background, Bruce Springsteen, well, almost Bruce Springsteen, the whole beautifully packaged, Hollywood-approved version of grief and courage and unconventional love. But here's the thing about packages. Someone always wraps them. And what gets left outside the wrapping? That's the story nobody told you. Because before Florence Rusty Tullis died in November 2006, she talked. She gave interviews, sat across from reporters, looked cameras dead in the eye, and said things about her son Rocky, about the movie that made him famous, and about the life they actually lived together that Hollywood never put on screen. And some of what she said was generous. And some of what she said was damning. And some of it was both at the same time. Today, we're going inside the real story. Not the one Peter Bogdanovich directed, but the one Rusty Dennis actually lived. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's go back to the beginning. Before any of this existed, before the film, before the fame, before the tragedy became a brand. Roy Lee Dennis came into the world on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California. His parents called him Rocky almost immediately because as a baby, the only thing that would settle him down was being rocked. He was a sickly infant. Ear infections, sinus problems, the kind of recurring illness that worried parents but didn't alarm doctors. Then, somewhere around age 2, he went in for a routine tonsillectomy. Routine until the x-ray technician looked at his skull and went very, very still. What followed was close to a year of visits to UCLA Medical Center multiple times each week, examination after examination, specialist after specialist, until the diagnosis finally landed: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a disease so rare that when Rusty first heard those words in 1965, doctors told her only 6 other documented cases existed in all of recorded medical history. Not 6 in California, 6 in the world. The condition works like this. Calcium deposits accumulate abnormally in the skull. Bone thickens. It pushes outward and inward simultaneously, distorting facial structure, compressing the brain, slowly destroying vision and hearing and neurological function. The prognosis the doctors handed Rusty was blunt to the point of brutality. Her son would go blind. He would likely suffer intellectual deterioration. And he would be dead before he turned 7 years old. Dead at 7. That was the medical establishment's verdict on Rocky Dennis. And the medical establishment did not know Rusty Dennis. Now, to understand what Rusty said before she died and why it cuts the way it does, you have to understand who Rusty actually was. Not the Cher version. Not the sympathetic anti-heroine with the smudged eyeliner and the heart of gold. The real woman. Florence Tullis. Born Steinberg, grew up in Brooklyn, New York on May 29, 1936. Her father drove trucks. She was sharp, stubborn, and allergic to authority from childhood. By 13, she had been kicked out of junior high for truancy. By 14, she was smoking marijuana and running with motorcycle gangs. By 15, she had dropped out of school entirely and taken a job as a dancer at Coney Island, the kind of dancer they called a hoochie coochie girl, and she was not yet old enough to hold a learner's permit. At 17, she married a truck driver named Tommy Mason. They had a son together, Joshua. That marriage collapsed, and Rusty came home to her parents. Then came Roy Dennis and California and Rocky. By the time Rocky was diagnosed, Rusty had already built her entire worldview around a single absolute conviction: that human beings have the power to make themselves well. She had decided, somewhere in her chaotic early life, that if a person could make themselves sick through their own mind and choices, then the reverse had to also be true. And she raised Rocky on that philosophy from the very beginning. Every headache, every flare of pain, every bad day, she sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. She meant it as empowerment. She meant it as love. Whether it was always both of those things simultaneously is a question that Rusty's own words eventually force you to sit with. She rode with the Turks' motorcycle gang, real bikers, not weekend enthusiasts, and those people became Rocky's extended family. The film's character Gar, played by Sam Elliott, is drawn from a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's longtime partner. That biker circle was an atmosphere. It was the actual community that held Rocky's childhood together. And on drug use, Rusty was direct in a way the movie carefully sidestepped. She pushed back hard on the film's framing of her substance use as something born from pain or desperation. She said clearly, in multiple interviews, that she partied constantly and that drugs were simply part of that lifestyle. She wasn't drowning and reaching for a life raft. She was choosing a life, and that life included drugs, and she owned it without apology. That distinction mattered to her enormously. In 1985, Mask reached theaters across America. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich, Cher as Rusty, Eric Stoltz as Rocky, buried under hours of prosthetic makeup. The film grossed over $48 million at the box office, and Rusty Dennis received $15,000 for the film rights to her life and her dead son story. $15,000 against $48 million. That arithmetic is its own kind of verdict on how Hollywood values the people whose pain it transforms into entertainment. And here's the layer underneath that number that almost nobody discusses. According to multiple sources, including the film's own documentation, most of that $15,000 went directly toward medical bills for her older son Joshua, who was at that time battling AIDS. Rusty didn't sell Rocky's story for herself. She sold one son's story, trying to keep another son alive. When reporters came to her after the film's release expecting gratitude, maybe tears, maybe the kind of gracious Hollywood cooperation that makes for clean press junkets, what they got instead was Rusty Dennis being exactly who she had always been, honest in a way that made people uncomfortable. She called the film a fairy tale. Her words, not a critic's, not a journalist's interpretation. A fairy tale. She told the Chicago Tribune in 1986 that she had always imagined a film about Rocky's courage, something that might help disabled children and the parents raising them, who she observed were sometimes more disabled by their own fear than their kids ever were by their conditions. What she got instead was a film that centered her as much as it centered Rocky. A film that split its focus and turned her into a complicated anti-heroine. She didn't hate that exactly, but she hadn't expected it, and she was honest about the gap between expectation and reality. On Cher's performance specifically, Rusty was actually generous. She told the Chicago Tribune that Cher had depicted her accurately, that she had always considered herself perfectly normal and believed the rest of the world was the problem. That quote, "I always thought I was perfectly normal, that the rest of the world is nuts," is as precise a self-portrait as Rusty ever offered anyone. The two biggest factual departures she flagged publicly were these. First, the film compressed more than a decade of events into what appeared to be roughly a single year. Second, and this one visibly stung her, her older son Joshua was written out of the story entirely. A son she loved, a son she was actively fighting to keep alive at the very moment the film was being released, simply did not exist on screen. And then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen with the kind of devotion that teenage fans pour into that particular artist, complete and total. Director Peter Bogdanovich built the original soundtrack around Springsteen's catalog specifically because of that. Then Universal Pictures couldn't close a licensing deal with Columbia Records, and without telling Bogdanovich, they swapped the entire Springsteen soundtrack for Bob Seger tracks. Rusty appeared on a San Francisco talk show in 1985 and said her son and Seger's music. "I don't think he even knew who Bob Seger was." 6 words. Devastating and precise. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal for $19 million, arguing the substitution violated his final cut rights. The Springsteen music wasn't restored until the 2004 Director's Cut DVD, 2 decades after the film originally opened. Rocky's own soundtrack, the music that had actually been the score of his real life, took 20 years to make it back into his own story. By September of 1978, Rocky was 16 years old. The disease that had been given a 7-year deadline on his life had taken 16 years to approach its finish line, and now it was close. He was using a wheelchair. The headaches that had followed him through his entire childhood had escalated into something that medication could no longer meaningfully touch. On the evening of October 3rd, 1978, Rocky, Rusty, and the biker family around them went out together to a restaurant. It was visible to everyone at that table how much ground he had lost. After dinner, they came home. Rocky had a headache, and Rusty did what she had done his entire life. Every single time, she sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died in his sleep that night, at home, at 16 years old, just weeks away from 17. He had outlived his medical death sentence by nearly a decade. The film depicts Rusty discovering his body herself, a raw, private, devastating scene that Cher plays with real power. Here is what actually happened. At the time of Rocky's death, Rusty was not at home. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner Bernie called to tell her that Rocky was gone. That gap between the movie's version and reality isn't there to indict Rusty. It's there to show you how much distance exists between the polished version of a life and the actual texture of it. Hollywood smoothed those edges because rough edges make audiences uncomfortable. Rusty never smoothed anything. She told the truth about where she was. And the make yourself well philosophy she had applied to Rocky his entire life. She never publicly walked it back. She never framed it as a mistake or expressed guilt about the fact that those were the last words she ever said to her son. What she did say, repeatedly and clearly, was that she believed in that philosophy completely, that she believed it had given Rocky something essential, a life lived without ever seeing himself as someone who was dying. Whether that's comfort or something more complicated depends entirely on what you bring to the question. And Rusty was never going to answer that for you. To understand Rusty Dennis fully, you have to look at Joshua, because Hollywood erasing him from Rocky's story was a wound she couldn't entirely close. Joshua Mason was Rusty's firstborn, the son from her first marriage. He was a writer living in San Francisco when Mask was released. A year after the film came out, he was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer closely associated with AIDS during the epidemic's most brutal years. He was openly gay. By his own account, Rusty was abortive, imperfect, as she was imperfect in everything but present. Joshua died in 1987 at 32 years old. Rusty had now buried both of her sons. The $15,000 from the film rights, the money the studio paid her for Rocky's story, had gone to try to keep Joshua alive. It had not been enough. In that same Chicago Tribune interview, she said of Joshua, "Joshua doesn't believe in dying, and neither do I." She meant it. She had applied that conviction to Rocky his entire life. She was now applying it to Joshua. And when it was her own turn, she applied it to herself. After Rocky died, Rusty moved to San Francisco and rebuilt herself in ways that the leather jacket image from the film would never have predicted. She took up Buddhism. She began working as a counselor supporting people struggling with drug addiction. She was involved with the Shawnee Project, an organization providing support to terminally ill patients, many of them dying from AIDS during the most devastating years of that crisis. The woman who had once defined herself by chaos was building something quieter, something that bore the weight of everything she had lost. She still rode motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Florence Tullis was riding her three-wheel motorcycle when the right tire separated from the wheel. She lost control. The bike hit a curb, and her body struck a telephone pole. What followed was harrowing in a particular way. No one knew. There was no announcement. Friends and family had no idea what had happened until a brief item in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune mentioned an unidentified 70-year-old woman injured in a motorcycle accident. People who knew her made the connection and came to her. She had broken both legs and suffered a punctured lung. She survived the crash itself. She was Rusty Dennis. Of course she survived the crash. But the infection that followed the injuries was a thing she could not fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. She died the way she had lived, moving, on her own terms, unable to stop. So strip away the movie. Strip away Cher's performance, which was genuinely brilliant and which Rusty herself acknowledged. Strip away the soundtrack dispute and the missing son and the $15,000 against $48 million. Strip all of it away and look at what's actually there. Rocky Dennis lived 16 years with a disease that should have ended his life before he finished first grade. He graduated junior high as an honor student. He was voted best buddy, most good-natured, friendliest camper. He tutored his classmates and negotiated his own rates for it. He memorized the night sky. He fell in love at summer camp with a girl who was blind and could not see his face, and she saw everything about him that mattered. When doctors offered him surgery to alter his features, he asked them, who would he see in the mirror if they changed his face? And he chose to keep his own face. His mother was a Brooklyn-born biker with a drug habit, a gap in her formal education, and absolute certainty that the world was more broken than her son was. She was right about that last part. She fought every institution that tried to limit him. She refused every prognosis that tried to define him. She built him a family out of rough, loyal people who loved him without conditions. And on the last night of his life, she told him to go make himself well. She had told him that every day of his life, and every day of his life, he had tried. Screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan put it plainly. Rusty Dennis was not the PTA Mother of the Year, but she was exactly the mother Rocky needed. Whether that reads as a compliment or a complication is something each person has to decide for themselves. What is not up for debate is this. Rocky Dennis died at home, in his own bed, in his sleep, without machines and without indignity. Rusty had promised him that, and she kept it. That's the story she told before she died. Not polished, not packaged, exactly as complicated as it actually was. And now you know.